Thank you so much for the introduction. So first of all, thank you for having me here. Today I have a little bit of a tricky topic because my focus is much more about the different types of targets we tend to see what corporates are setting. And as you can see as well, in terms of the framework, in terms of trends that we're seeing is that it's getting more and more stringent. So this is just something I would like to focus on today and to really explain roughly what kind of pathway you can follow based on what kind of target framework you're following as well. So just a really quick agenda. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction of us as a company, Reset Carbon, and then I want to go into the reason why there are urgencies and drivers to act. And before we go into, demystifying some of the carbon targets, because again, like I said before, it's a little bit confusing. And then afterward, I would like to go through the mitigation pathways as well. So just quickly about Reset. We've actually been in Hong Kong since 2009, so we've been around for quite a while. For sustainability consulting, I think it's quite amazing that we've been in Hong Kong for over 12 years now. In terms of what kind of work we do as well, we do a lot of the sustainability strategy. As our company name is Reset Carbon, so we do a lot of decarbonisation strategy as well for corporates. On top of kind of building strategy, I think what's really important as well is not purely just building a strategy, but really about action plan development. So at the end of the day, you can have a beautiful strategy, but you can't implement it. And I think that's where we really differentiate as a company, is we also help our companies with implementation as well. We also do resource efficiency kind of assessment and energy assessment, knowledge transfer and stakeholder engagement, as well as project management. But what really differentiates us as a company is the fact that we do use a collaborative empowerment approach. It's what I like to call how we work with our clients. So at the end of the day, how we see sustainability is really about people collaborating together, and the fact that we also don't use really a cookie cutter approach to consulting as well. So we really tailor our services based on the client needs. And I think the empowerment part is important because it's also about empowering, the corporate, my client's team as well, so that they can do the thing and they can do it well. And so just overall kind of the client portfolio, we've been really lucky today, and in terms of kind of the clients we've been working with and, really helping them on their carbon and reduction strategy as well. So we tend to co-develop a lot of the solutions with our client to make sure that it really meets your needs, because at the end of the day, you understand your operation the best, and we're not going to understand it better than you. So it's really about co-development here in terms of creation of strategy. And what we've actually worked on as well is kind of going beyond carbon, is also kind of touching on the other area, for example, like water, supply chain, and also kind of waste as well are the key areas we focus in. And so, okay, enough about the company, which is the boring part, I believe. So now what I want to explain to you is why are companies increasingly setting aggressive carbon targets? So what I love about these two charts, if it works on your screen, which I hope it does, is it's a little bit slow on my screen. But basically, what I wanted to show you is the impact of climate change in terms of global temperature, as well as the CO2 concentration. And what you can see is that the circle in the left and the right is just keep increasing, right? So actually, right now, we're already at 1 degree of warming. We're not even looking at kind of less than 1 degree. We're already at 1 degree warming. And therefore, what we tend to see as well is because of the extreme weather events that's been happening as well, we're seeing that there are more and more actually the heat waves, for example, or kind of like the wildfires we're seeing are also creating really a collective commitment to act on climate change. Climate change doesn't feel like something which is very far away. It feels like it's right here, and people want action now. And what we tend to see as well is something I'll keep mentioning is the 1.5 degree. Okay, so right now, if we're looking at where we're at in terms of the current policy, it is more than likely that it's going to take us to 3 degrees. Okay, this is something we really, really want to avoid. But right now, if we're looking at the kind of policy, it's taking us to 3 degrees. But what we really need to do in order for us to actually hit what we call 1.5, which is considered as the area where we want to get to, it's considered as safe for us, well, really avoiding the most adverse impact of climate change. What we really need to do is to get to 1.5 degree. And what does that mean? It means that we need to get to net zero by 2050. And right now, looking at where we're at, unfortunately, the world is actually on track to exceed 1.5 warming by 2030 at the very earliest. So there's a lot that needs to be done right now in order for us to make sure that we don't hit 2 degrees and in order for us to hit the 1.5 degree. And what you can see as well is what's clear from the IPCC report is that climate-related risks, unfortunately at 2 degrees, is much worse than 1.5 degree. And you can also see in the chart as well is the local implications. So obviously there's going to be extreme hot nights, which we're already feeling. And also there's going to be more risk of, for example, stronger typhoon as well, and et cetera, et cetera. So basically what we really want to do is to hit 1.5 degree. And from that as well, given the kind of like climate change impact being much more visible than ever before, we're also seeing that there are collective commitments to urgently act on climate change. And we're seeing this everywhere. And since the Paris Agreement, in fact, even for me as a consultant, it's been really, really hard to just keep on track on what's happening in this space. And we're also seeing like businesses are really pulling their weight as well. So obviously we've got the EP100, EV100, RE100. We also have We Mean Business, which is really a coalition of businesses wanting to act on climate change. And then we also have the science-based target, which I will address later. And we're also getting a lot more investor pressure than ever before as well. And I think all that pressure is really good in a way that because it pushes us into areas where historically we probably wouldn't be setting such aggressive carbon target without this pressure. But at the same time, it's also a little bit tricky for you to, I would say, even navigate, even for a sustainability practitioner, especially when we start talking about loads of different terms like CDP, TCFD, and GRISB. But essentially what it does is all these businesses are actually, all these kind of like associations are also pulling together to create those collective commitment as well in order for us to act on climate change. And so obviously great news for us in this sector is that we're finally getting some really clear signal as well from China and Hong Kong that they're looking to achieve carbon neutrality. For China, it'll be 2060, and for Hong Kong, it'll be 2050. And we also know that there will be a climate action plan coming out also in Q2 this year as well. So we're very excited to see this. In terms of what we're expecting in the climate action plan, there's a lot of unknowns right now. But it was mentioned in the policy address when Carrie Lam actually made the announcement of the target that there will be a zero carbon. Within that policy address, it was mentioned that there are a few commitments within kind of like doing the carbon neutrality target. And part of it will be zero carbon energy, decarbonisation technology, and also really kind of enhancing energy efficiency in existing buildings and also new buildings, the zero carbon vehicles, as well as green finance, which I believe there has been some amazing movement in this space as well in the last year or two, and also a large-scale waste-to-energy facilities. However, right now, we still don't really know what's going to be in the action plan. And we're very excited to see this, and we can't wait to actually get to go through the whole action plan and see how this would actually impact on our clients as well on their own carbon targets. So next, this is the techie bit. So demystifying carbon targets. What you've seen in the market so far is loads of different targets. So you've got carbon neutrality, you've got net zero, you've got net positive, you've got even net negative. And what do they all mean? So before I go into really explaining what they mean, I want to explain, first of all, some really basic terms in carbon accounting. And I hope that I can keep you focused here. Scope 1 and Scope 2 basically means that emissions that are coming from the company operation. So you've got Scope 2, which is the easiest one to understand, and that's basically emissions from purchased electricity. You also have Scope 1 as well. So those are kind of direct emissions from your operation. So what we like to call that is basically emissions from your own operation. But increasingly, because actually if you look at, let's say, a company's carbon footprint, the overall kind of profile, what we tend to see as well is Scope 3, what we call as company value chain. So emissions from your value chain actually do make up a huge chunk of your overall footprint. And to date, that has not been a focus. And when we talk about the value chain, it's also about upstream as well as downstream as well. So for example, if we think about a real estate company, we might be looking at embodied carbon in construction materials. As you can imagine, steel will be a huge part of that emission, right? So that's why going forward is not purely about reducing your emissions in your own operation, but it's also about your value chain as well. And so next, okay, this the writing is a little bit small on the screen, but I think what I wanted to explain here is increasingly because of science-based targets, it's much harder than before to actually greenwash your way through having just a operational efficiency target. And I feel that given the kind of movement as well in target setting, and that there are more and more increasingly stringent framework on how to define what is a good target versus what is a bad target, you actually have to be navigating very carefully in which target you're going to end up setting. So just quickly on the science-based target. First of all, this refers to basically a target that is in line with basically the scale of reduction needed in order for us to basically hit below 2 or 1.5 degree. Apologies. And what's really good about the science-based target is that it actually has a validation mechanism. So you can't just say, I'm setting a science-based target and I have a science-based target. No, you can't do that because you also need your target to be approved as well. As mentioned before as well, if you set a science-based target, basically it means that you are in line with 1.5 degree. So basically you're in line with climate science, which is great. At the next level, we also have something called a science-based target net zero. And currently, that is actually in draft. So this is still going through consultation at the moment. But this target, what's really different about this target is that it is a value chain target in order for us to hit 1.5 degree. So what I mentioned before about going beyond your operation, this one requires you to actually set a target beyond your own operation, and all your value chain emissions will need to be included in this target. And in terms of the validation mechanism, at the moment we believe it's in development, and this will also be in line 1.5 degree. But next, we start thinking about the other terms like carbon neutrality and net zero. And basically, they all kind of head to the same direction, is that, it's more about compensating for your emissions so that you become net zero carbon, basically. But frankly, there is no framework on these terms. So at the moment, there are a lot of kind of like, it's quite ambiguous what it means when it comes to a company setting carbon neutral target. We believe that they mean well, but at the same time, it can't really be defined as per like science-based targets. In terms of validation mechanism, there isn't such a thing in place at the moment, and it may not also be in line with 1.5 degree. I think I'm having the same problem as you. Okay, so just quickly on the boundary and the emission sources as well. So when it comes to science-based target and science-based target net zero target, it's usually set at the corporate level. But when it comes to, let's say, a carbon neutrality target, it could be at the asset level. It's really difficult to tell what is the target boundary. When it comes to the emission sources, SBT requires you to set a target for your Scope 1 and Scope 2 and any material Scope 3. So that's what we mean by value chain emissions. And only the material ones. So basically, there is a rule, there's a threshold you need to hit. So let's say if your overall emissions for your entire company, in terms of Scope 3, is actually over 40% of your overall footprint, which includes Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, then you will need to set a target for Scope 3 as well. When it comes to the science-based target net zero, it's all of it. You don't have a choice. Regardless of how material, how immaterial, you will need to quantify all your Scope 3 emissions, and you would need to set a target for all of that. And in terms of the net zero carbon target and the carbon neutrality, in terms of kind of the boundary and emission sources, is really up to the company, what they choose. There isn't really a universal framework at the moment on this, so it's a little bit difficult for us to kind of evaluate, especially compare a target from one company to another is really hard for us to do so. So overall, just the key dimensions in corporate target. Obviously, we need to look at what's in scope. So what are you including in your target boundary? And this, we're also observing that in terms of what target you're setting now, it will be also, you'll be expecting increasing scrutiny from your stakeholders as well, because now there are frameworks in place versus what it used to be, let's say even 5 years ago, when your target cannot really be compared to another company. So the scrutiny is going to increase in this. And also it's about kind of what you're including as kind of source of emissions as well. But also after that, after you kind of define your target boundary, it's also about your mitigation strategy as well as the time frame. So for example, even your base year will now be in increasing scrutiny from client stakeholders as well. So I think just to give you an example of some of the science-based targets set by the local corporates, so we also have Swire Properties and also Swire Coca-Cola as well. The Swire Properties target is actually in line with the 2 degrees Celsius, and I believe that they're also looking to go in line with 1.5 going forward. With the Swire Coca-Cola is already in line with 1.5. As you can see, these targets are quite aggressive. And in terms of the base year as well, they're quite recent as well. And the fact that they're also looking into the value chain. For example, you have Swire Properties. They also have a very heavy tenants engagement program as well. So it really is going beyond just purely about energy efficiency. So this is just kind of what I wanted to share with you as some of the examples of the science-based targets set by local corporates. At the next level, the term mitigation might seem a bit like, what is that? So basically, these are basically some of the options you can consider. If you're going to set different targets, what are considered as kind of the options that you can use to actually mitigate against the emissions. So abatement is very simple. Abatement is basically reducing energy demand or energy efficiency. So even though the word sounds complicated, it actually isn't. In terms of compensation, okay, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Okay, so in terms of compensation, basically it's like buying offset credits, right? So high quality offsets in order to compensate the emissions you're creating in your value chain or your direct operation as well. And neutralization, this is something I won't focus too much attention on today, but neutralization is about removal of the carbon emissions. And we know that from what we can see as well in the sector is that for some of these sectors that are in what we call hard to abate sectors, so for example, like steel or construction, we know that it's more than likely that even by 2050, they will not be able to actually abate all the emissions, through existing technologies. And they would need to look into neutralization, which includes carbon removal, in order for us to get to net zero. But right now, the technology is still very, very immature, and I think it's not really proven at scale. So our focus is much more on abatement still. And at the next level, one thing to really bear in mind as well when you set any kind of target as well is looking at mitigation hierarchy, because what we're seeing is that increasingly you will also get you will have to be very careful in how much you choose to, let's say, offset versus what you choose to abate. And there are more and more attention being focused in this right now. So it's really important whenever we recommend a client, we always say follow the mitigation hierarchy. And that's very simple. It's very simple as like waste management. First thing you try and do is to avoid emissions. So if you don't create the waste in the first place, well, you have less problem to solve, right? Because you're not emitting emissions. So simple. At the next level is about reducing. So it's about energy efficiency, about looking into renewables as well as off-site renewables as options as well. And finally, only for the what we call as residue emissions that you cannot abate, you should look into the compensation or the neutralization options. So this is just some examples of, for example, under abatement, with energy demand reduction, energy efficiency, and also electrification coupled with the grid decarbonisation and the on-site renewables and fuel switch as well. So basically, this is for you to kind of reduce or even eliminate or even prevent sources of emissions in the first place. So again, obviously, this is the way to go. In terms of compensation, bear in mind that when we look at the Science-Based Target Initiative net zero definition, you actually can't use compensation, so buying carbon offsets as a way to hit your target, but it's optional. So you can still choose to go beyond and say that, no, we are going to compensate for our emissions, and this is optional, and this is recommended. So offset is still a very good way for you to also reduce your emissions. And what's really good potentially about compensation measures as well is the fact that there are a lot of co-benefits around carbon offsets. It's not purely just from environmental attribute perspective, but it's also about, for example, when we think about reforestation as well, or afforestation, kind of like having those offsets could also benefit the local community, and potentially it can also move certain funds as well, so mobilize certain finances for development country to actually go for greener technologies. So all in all, compensation is also an option you can think about as well. So just to finalize, abatement, as you can see, for whichever framework you're looking at, is really accepted across the board. So everyone always say abatement should really be the key focus. And we know that a lot of the time when we work with our clients as well, we know that they've already done an awful lot in energy efficiency. But when we talk about science-based target and also net zero as well, this is almost like a way that how decisions are being made in an organization will need to be transformed. It really isn't what we're used to, which is purely on operational gain or cost efficiency or cost savings. So there needs to be some kind of transition as well. And we know it's hard to engage stakeholders, especially internally, to get them excited on this. And that's why a lot of the time when we work on this project with our clients, it's less so about what technologies are there, because a lot of the time they already know these technologies, but it's much more about getting people on board, getting people understand what these terms actually mean. Even the term sustainability or decarbonization is actually quite alienating because it's confusing, right? So I think it's really about kind of bringing people on board as well. And when it comes to compensation, as you can see with Science-Based Target and Science-Based Target Initiative Net Zero, it's not accepted unfortunately. But the thing is, even for the science-based target net zero, it does allow for offsets as an optional thing as well in the meantime while we transition into net zero. So it's still accepted as you're allowed to do this. And in terms of the net zero carbon target, and finally for carbon neutrality, is free for all pretty much. You can do whatever you want because there is no universal framework for this. And that is the risk, because we know that stakeholders are already closing in on these definitions. So what we tend to do as well, just a final message, is future-proof your target, because your target is about your future, and if you don't future-proof it now, this is going to be your risk going forward.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And now, before we move to Q&A section, definitely, if there's any burning questions or questions that you would like to ask Cindy, remember to now press the question mark icon on the top right corner of the screen, then select the question and answer sections under the drop-down menu. Type your questions inside the message box. Remember to click the button to send your questions to us. So now I think we have a few questions lining up for Cindy's section. First question is, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on carbon emissions?
Well, obviously, it mostly went down. I think in theory, this is good for a lot of corporate targets, but that's only if you're setting an absolute target. So when we're talking about targets, it's also the target type you're choosing as well. So you have intensity target, which means that it's usually normalized with a specific metric that is linked to your business. In that case, as you can imagine, the ratio is going to be all over the place. So for companies like that, they may not benefit from the absolute reduction. But when we think about absolute reduction, I think basically, yes, they will probably, especially most sectors except a few, would probably be seeing some kind of reduction in their emissions. But at the same time, I think what we're seeing in terms of this year as well is even like association, even if, for example, they might have a program that is linked to carbon reduction, this year is actually considered as void in some of these association frameworks as well. So just bear this in mind, even though we're likely to see the reduction, but we're also expecting this to go up in the short run as well.
Thank you, Cindy. One more question. It's regarding also the carbon emission. Well, actually, carbon emission is definitely unavoidable when we develop economies. What tips do you have for the local companies when they also want to try to minimize the carbon intensity?
So if it's carbon intensity, I think obviously a huge part of it. I mean, if we look at kind of like the mitigation pathway as well, obviously abatement is a huge part of it. So for example, you've got like, green building. It's really about, minimizing and kind of building as green as possible. And what we're also increasingly seeing, for example, are like, super low E buildings. And we know that, the local GBC is already working on this as well with a few corporates in Hong Kong. So really building it as efficiently as possible. And I think this goes back to what Kelvin also explained previously as well. It's about understanding the energy impact based on the decisions you made at the building level when you design it, I think. And after that, it's also about, when at the operational level, it's about improving energy efficiency. And that's not purely just from plugging in a new technology in there. A lot of it is also based on behavior as well. So that has a huge part to play, I would say. And obviously after that, you also have grid decarbonisation as well. When we're talking about science-based target, you're talking about much longer term. So you're talking about 2030 or even 2035 or beyond. So we're also expecting there to be improvement over grid decarbonisation over time as well. And this will also be helpful, for example, if looking to electrify as well. And I think after that, obviously looking at on-site renewable as well as consider off-site renewable as part of your strategy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cindy, for the fantastic sharing with us.